Right now, as you are listening to this, you probably think you're just sitting in a room, just kind of absorbing the reality around you.
Yeah, that's the standard assumption.
Right. You think you're hearing my voice. You think you're seeing uh, the light coming through the window or maybe the screen of your phone, but you aren't. I mean, not directly,
Not even close to directly.
because your brain, the actual physical organ that is doing the experiencing, is sealed inside a pitch black, entirely silent vault of bone. It has absolutely no direct access to the outside world.
None at all.
So every sound you hear, every color you see right now is essentially well, a highly educated hallucination.
It really is a profound shift in perspective. I mean, the standard comfortable model we all grew up with is that perception is passive, right? We treat the eyes and ears like a camera and a microphone.
We're just recording.
Exactly. The light floods in, the sound waves hit the eardrum, the brain develops the film, and voila, objective reality is just, presented to you on a little screen inside your head.
But when you actually step into the world of Bayesian cognitive science, that whole camera analogy is just completely dismantled.
It's totally backwards.
We're looking at a perceptual landscape that is entirely inverted. And if the brain isn't a passive camera, what is it? It seems less like a recording device and more like this highly anxious, isolated fortune teller.
I love that analogy.
Like it's locked in a dark room, frantically trying to guess what is happening outside just to avoid being caught off guard.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. But the nuance here is the sheer aggression of the process.
Aggression.
Yeah, the brain isn't just sitting back and making casual predictions. It is a relentless, proactive prediction machine. It's constantly projecting its guesses outward, literally demanding that the sensory data conform to its expectations.
Which is exactly why we are going on a deep dive into this today. We are exploring how your brain actually generates the subjective experience of reality.
And it is a massive topic.
It is. Our guide for this is a dense, absolutely fascinating 2021 review article. It's from the journal Neuroscience of Consciousness.
By Victor Roureau.
Right, Victor Roureau. And the paper is titled, let me make sure I get this right, Bayesian Theories of Consciousness. A review in search for a minimal unifying model.
The mission of this paper is incredibly ambitious. I mean, over the last 15 to 20 years, Bayesian cognitive science has just exploded.
It's everywhere now.
Yeah, and it's produced this massive, sometimes conflicting array of theories about how the mechanics of prediction actually create the feeling of being conscious.
Right.
So Roureau is trying to sift through all these warring factions to find the lowest common denominators. He's searching for what researchers call a minimal unifying model.
MUM.
Exactly. We are looking for the bare minimum architectural requirements that must exist in a system, any system, for a conscious experience to occur.
And just to connect this directly to you, the listener, right now, understanding this isn't just some abstract academic exercise. Every sight, every feeling, the physical sensation of the chair beneath you or the ground under your feet, it is all a carefully constructed internal simulation.
Every single bit of it.
And understanding the hidden mechanics of this simulation can completely rewire how you relate to your own attention, how you form habits, and really how you perceive the fundamental nature of your own reality.
It forces you to take a level of ownership over your perception. Because you're not a victim of your senses, right? You are the active architect of your world, building it from the inside out, millisecond by millisecond.
But see, this immediately brings up a terrifying philosophical question for me.
Oh, lay it on me.
If my brain is just this isolated fortune teller, trapped in a skull, constantly guessing what's out there, am I ever actually experiencing objective reality? Or am I just forever trapped inside my brain's best draft of it?
That is the big question. And to answer whether you're experiencing objective reality, we have to look at the foundational law that governs all of this predictive machinery.
Okay, where do we start?
In Bayesian science, this is known as the free energy principle.
The free energy principle.
Right. The neuroscientist Carl Friston really popularized this. And it starts with a premise that sounds almost too simple to be useful, which is any living system, to remain alive, must minimize the dispersion of its constituent states.
Okay, wait. Dispersion of constituent states sounds like something straight out of a graduate-level thermodynamics textbook.
It kind of is.
Let's translate that into biology for me.
Sure. Let's start with the basic physics of the universe. The universe is governed by the second law of thermodynamics, which basically means everything naturally moves toward entropy.
Chaos.
Exactly. The universe wants everything to reach equilibrium. It wants to smear all energy and matter out into a uniform, chaotic, lukewarm soup.
Okay.
So being alive is, by definition, the act of actively resisting that soup.
So if I think about a rock is at equilibrium with its environment. It doesn't resist the temperature of the room or the erosion of the wind.
Right. Just accepts it.
But a biological organism have to fight it.
Precisely. To be a living system means maintaining what physicists call a non-equilibrium steady state. You have to keep your body temperature within a very narrow, highly improbable range.
Like 98.6 degrees.
Yeah. Your blood sugar, your oxygen levels, your physical boundaries, they all must remain tightly restricted. If your states disperse too much, like if your internal body temperature drops to match the ambient temperature of a freezing winter night, you reach equilibrium.
And biologically, reaching equilibrium is the definition of death.
You've got it. That's exactly it.
So existence as a living creature is a constant uphill battle against probability. It is highly improbable that my molecules are organized into a functioning human being, and it's highly probable they should just be scattered ash.
Yes.
Staying alive means staying in a highly specific, very narrow state of being.
Yes. And to maintain this highly improbable state, the organism must minimize what information theorists call surprisal.
Surprisal, like literal surprise.
Mathematically, yes. In this framework, surprisal is equivalent to entropy. If you are a freshwater fish, finding yourself suddenly flopping on dry land is a massive deviation from your expected survivable state.
Right, it's highly surprising to your biology.
Exactly. To stay alive, you must act to avoid surprises. You must predict where the water is and stay in it.
Okay, I understand the physical survival aspect of avoiding surprise. I get the fish out of water thing. But how does this scale up to the brain? How does a collection of neurons help an organism avoid the surprise of entropy?
This is where we bring in a brilliant concept from cybernetics called the good regulator theorem.
The good regulator theorem.
Formulated by Conant and Ross Ashby back in 1970, the theorem states that every good regulator of a system must actually be a model of that system.
A model of the system. Let's break that down.
Think about a basic thermostat in your house. For the thermostat to regulate the temperature, to keep it steady, it must contain a rudimentary model of the room's temperature dynamics.
It has to have a baseline expectation of what normal is and a way to measure deviations from it.
Exactly. Now scale that up to surviving in an infinitely complex, chaotic, and dangerous world. Your brain cannot afford to just passively react to stimuli.
Because it's too slow.
Way too slow. By the time the visual data of a leaping tiger reaches your conscious awareness processes and initiates a physical reaction to run away, you are already lunch.
Right.
To survive, your brain must literally be a generative statistical model of the world. It must constantly anticipate what sensory inputs are coming next before they even arrive.
So the brain is constantly throwing these top-down predictions down the neural hierarchy. Like it's telling the eyes, the ears, the skin, based on my current internal model of reality. In the next millisecond, I expect to see this specific shape, hear this specific frequency, and feel this specific texture.
That is the core mechanism. The brain generates the prediction, and then it compares that top-down prediction with the bottom-up sensory data actually coming in from the sense organs.
Okay. And when there's a mismatch, when the prediction doesn't equal the reality coming in.
That mismatch creates what we call a prediction error.
Prediction error.
Yeah. That error is the literal mathematical measurement of surprise. And according to the free energy principle, the brain's entire operating system, its singular driving imperative, is dedicated to minimizing that free energy. It must minimize the prediction error.
Now, the source material lays out that there were really only two ways the brain can resolve these prediction errors.
Yeah.
Two ways to force the equation to balance.
Right. The first method is called perceptual inference. This is the more intuitive one, really.
Okay, what is it?
This is when the brain updates its internal model to match the incoming sensory data. Essentially, you change your mind.
So, updating the guess.
Yes. Say you are walking in the woods at twilight. Your brain projects a top-down hypothesis. There is a snake on the path.
Because it's dark and you're primed for danger.
Exactly. But as you step closer, the incoming visual data from your retina, the lack of scales, the rigid shape starts generating massive prediction errors. The snake model can no longer account for the bottom-up data.
So the brain has to scrap the model. It updates the simulation to say, okay, new hypothesis. It's a fallen branch.
Exactly.
And the prediction now matches the sensory input. The error drops to zero. and the surprise is resolved.
That's perceptual inference.
That makes perfect sense. That's like a good scientist running an experiment, getting unexpected data, and humbly rewriting their hypothesis.
Right.
But the second way to resolve the error, this one seems much stranger to me.
The second method is active inference. In perceptual inference, you change your internal model to fit the world. In active inference, you change the world to fit your internal model.
You change the world.
Yeah. You physically act on the environment to force the sensory input to match your top-down prediction.
Okay, wait. Let me try to build an analogy for this because it sounds completely counterintuitive. If perceptual inference is the humble scientist rewriting their theory, active inference sounds like a corrupt, incredibly stubborn scientist.
Aha, a stubborn scientist.
Like, they run the experiment, the data completely contradicts their hypothesis, but instead of changing their mind, they just smash the lab equipment, alter the variables, and physically force the environment to give them the result they already decided was true. Is our physical behavior just a way of bullying the world into agreeing with our brain?
While corrupt might imply malicious intent, mechanically speaking, your analogy is spot on. Active inference is essentially the execution of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
A self-fulfilling prophecy.
Let's look at a really mundane action, drinking a cup of coffee. Your brain generates a top-down hypothesis. I am a person who is currently holding that coffee mug to my lips.
Okay.
But your bottom-up sensory input says my hands are empty and resting on the table. This creates a massive prediction error.
So instead of the brain updating the model to say, oh, I guess I'm not drinking coffee, it stubbornly holds on to the I am drinking coffee reality.
Yes, the brain clamps down on the hypothesis. It flat out refuses to change it. So the only way to resolve the mounting prediction error is for the motor system to fire.
Oh, wow.
Your arm reaches out, your fingers grasp the ceramic, you lift it to your mouth. As you execute the movement, the proprioceptive and tactile sensory feedback begins to align with the prediction. When the coffee hits your tongue, the error reaches zero.
That is mind-bending.
You moved your muscles to eliminate the discrepancy between your rigid internal model and the external world.
I am not reaching for the coffee because I desire it. My arm is moving to suppress the statistical alarm bells of a prediction error.
Mathematically, yes.
But obviously, there has to be a limit to this. My brain can't just rigidly hallucinate that I am a billionaire and force the world to comply. Which brings us to a fundamental equation that Rouault's paper heavily emphasizes, and I want to really dig into this. Free energy equals complexity minus accuracy. We have to unpack this trade-off.
This equation is the engine of the entire system. For your brain to generate an accurate generative model of reality one that produces very few prediction errors, it requires a high degree of complexity.
Right.
It needs to account for countless variables, from the physics of gravity to the complex social dynamics of the people around you.
But there's a trap here, right? Rouault talks about the danger of the model becoming too complex.
Yes. The trap is a phenomenon known in machine learning and statistics as overfitting. If your brain's model becomes incredibly complex in an attempt to perfectly map every single microscopic detail of past experiences, it becomes fragile. It loses its ability to generalize.
Let's use mapping a coastline as an example. If I want to make a perfectly accurate map of the California coast, I might try to map the exact location of every single boulder, every piece of driftwood, and every single grain of sand.
Yeah.
I crank the complexity to get maximum accuracy based on the data I have today.
Right.
But that map is completely useless tomorrow, right?
Exactly. The moment the tide comes in and moves a single piece of driftwood, your hyper-complex map generates massive prediction errors.
Because the sand shifted.
Yes. It fails because it overfitted to the specific noise of yesterday's data rather than capturing the generalized underlying structure of the coastline. To survive in a world that is inherently chaotic and constantly changing, your brain has to intentionally sacrifice some minute accuracy.
It has to dumb it down.
It must purposefully reduce complexity to create a robust, generalized model that can actually handle novelty.
I can actually feel this trade-off happening in real time when I learn a new physical skill. Think about the first time you get behind the wheel of a car with a manual transmission.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
At first, the complexity of the internal model you are trying to build is just overwhelming. You're consciously tracking the exact pressure of your left foot on the clutch, the angle of your right foot on the gas, the sound of the engine RPMs, the position of the gear shift, the traffic in the rearview mirror.
Your brain is attempting to map every individual variable with high accuracy, and it is incredibly computationally expensive.
Exhausting.
It generates huge amounts of prediction error, which is exactly why learning a new skill feels so frustrating and tiring.
But then fast forward 6 months. You don't think about the RPMs or the foot angles anymore. Your brain has sacrificed all that hyperspecific granular accuracy. It has compressed all those separate complex variables into a single highly robust motor schema, shifting gears.
You lose the conscious awareness of the microscopic details, but you gain a generalized behavior that doesn't completely break down if someone suddenly honks a horn at you while you're driving.
That is the perfect illustration of minimizing free energy by balancing complexity and accuracy. The compressed shifting gears model is less complex, but far more useful for long-term survival.
Exactly.
But this introduces a massive logistical problem for me.
What's that?
If my brain is constantly projecting these guesses and constantly receiving bottom-up sensory data from my eyes, my ears, every millimeter of my skin, my internal organs, it must be generating millions of prediction errors every single second.
Oh, absolutely.
Right now, the feeling of my shirt on my back is a prediction error. The hum of the air conditioner is a prediction error. The slight change in the light through the window is a prediction error. How does the brain not just short circuit?
It would, without a filter.
Right. There has to be a filtering mechanism to figure out which of these errors actually demand my attention and which can just be ignored.
You've hit on the exact necessity for the next major component of Bayesian theories. The brain needs a way to weigh the importance of all this incoming data. It needs what we might call the volume knob of reality.
Volume knob.
In the mathematical framework, this is known as precision.
Precision. Now, the paper defines this technically as the inverse variance of a probability distribution.
Yes.
We cannot let that phrase slide by. For anyone who isn't a statistician, what does inverse variance actually look like?
Let's visualize it. Imagine you are plotting your brain's confidence on a graph using a standard bell curve.
Okay, bell curve.
The peak of the curve is the guess itself, and the width of the curve is the variance, the uncertainty. If your brain receives a signal, but it is highly uncertain about it, the bell curve is very wide and very flat.
It covers a lot of possibilities, but commits to none.
Exactly. That is high variance, which means low precision.
So a wide, flat curve means the brain is saying, I am getting a signal, but I don't trust it. It's noisy.
Right. But if the brain receives a signal that is incredibly clear and reliable, the variance shrinks. The bell curve becomes a very tight, very sharp, high spike. That sharp spike is low variance, which translates to high precision. In plain terms, precision is simply the confidence score your brain assigns to a piece of information.
So it's literally asking, how much should I trust this data?
Exactly. And the brain can assign this precision score to bottom-up sensory signals, or it can assign it to its own top-down internal hypotheses.
Okay.
But the crucial insight that Ruro highlights, the paradigm shift here, is that these precisions are not static. The environment doesn't dictate them. The cognitive system has to actively, continuously infer and calculate them.
So it's constantly readjusting.
Yes. It must constantly ask the environment, given the current context, is my visual data reliable right now? Is my auditory data reliable?
Give me an example of the brain changing the precision weighting based on context.
Imagine driving in a thick, heavy fog.
Okay.
Your brain knows that visual data in fog is highly unreliable, so it actively turns down the precision weighting on your visual prediction errors. It essentially says, expect visual noise, ignore the slight shadowy shapes, don't overreact.
It mutes the eyes.
Basically. And at the same time, it might turn up the precision weighting on your auditory system, making you hyper-aware of the sound of other cars' tires on the wet road.
So the brain is operating a massive mixing board, sliding the volume faders up and down on different sensory streams based on how much it trusts them.
Yes. And here is the monumental takeaway from predictive processing. This continuous optimization of precision weightings is the exact mechanism that we subjectively experience as attention.
Attention.
Attention is not a spotlight shining around your brain. Attention is simply the brain turning up the precision volume on specific data.
That reframes so much of daily life. The paper breaks this down into two types of attention, exogenous and endogenous. Let's start with exogenous, because that sounds like it happens to us against our will.
Exogenous attention is bottom-up. It is driven by the environment. Imagine you are sitting in a quiet library reading, and someone drops a massive textbook on a wooden table. Bang.
Yeah, you jump.
Your brain calculates that a sensory signal with such extreme contrast and amplitude has a very high signal-to-noise ratio. It is undeniable data. So the brain automatically assigns it massive sensory precision.
The volume fader gets slammed to maximum.
Exactly. And your conscious awareness is immediately violently yanked toward the noise.
Because my brain determines the sound is too reliable and too important to ignore. What about endogenous attention?
Endogenous attention is top-down. It is driven by your internal goals and your active generative model. It is your voluntary focus.
Like me focusing on you right now.
Right. You're currently at a crowded, noisy coffee shop, but you are choosing to focus entirely on my voice. Your brain is actively modulating its own neural responses to assign high precision to the specific auditory frequencies of my speech, while simultaneously turning down the precision muting, the clatter of the espresso machine, and the chatter of other customers.
I am choosing to trust your voice and actively distrusting the background noise. Now, the source text uses a really striking example to illustrate how this precision weighting actually manipulates what we see. It references a change blindness experiment by the philosopher Jacob Howie.
Let's walk through this carefully because it absolutely blew my mind.
It is a brilliant demonstration of the volume knob in action. Imagine you are a subject in a lab sitting in front of a computer monitor. You are shown a photograph of a large commercial airplane sitting on a tarmac.
Okay, an airplane.
You look at it for a few seconds, then the screen flashes white for a fraction of a second, and a second photo appears.
Now, the second photo looks almost exactly the same, but the researchers have changed two distinct things. First, they have added big, high-contrast, ugly brown mud splashes all over the image of the plane.
Right.
And second, they have subtly, digitally erased one of the massive jet engines from the wing.
When subjects are put through this test, almost no one notices that the giant jet engine is missing at first. They stare right at the wing and don't see the massive structural absence. But why? If the brain is a prediction machine, a missing jet engine should be a huge prediction error. Planes are supposed to have engines.
It is a prediction error, but remember, the brain has to prioritize errors based on precision. When the second image flashes, the brain is suddenly confronted with those big, high-contrast mud splashes.
The mud is loud.
Very loud. The brain assigns very high precision to the mud because it is so visually striking. The mud acts as a highly effective distractor.
So the brain zeroes in on the mud, and it has to explain it away. It has to generate a top-down hypothesis to minimize the surprise of the dirt.
The brain quickly formulates a hypothesis. Okay, I am experiencing a transient occlusion, some dirt got on the camera lens, or a truck splashed mud on the plane.
Right.
But crucially, alongside this new hypothesis about the mud, the brain holds a massive, highly entrenched prior expectation about the physical world. It expects that the solid, physical object underneath the mud, the airplane itself, has remained fundamentally identical. Planes do not spontaneously lose engines in the span of a microsecond flash.
So the brain basically says, I've solved the big noisy problem. It's mud. And because I know planes don't change shape instantly, I'm going to trust my prior assumption that the plane is fine. Therefore, I'm going to actively mute any other subtle visual discrepancies coming from the image, because they're probably just noise caused by the mud.
Exactly. It turns down the volume on the prediction error coming from the wing. The visual data of the missing engine is hitting the retina, but the brain's precision weighting suppresses it.
It just ignores it.
It categorizes it as unreliable noise. It isn't until the brain has fully successfully modeled the mud, until that high-precision error is explained away, that it frees up the cognitive bandwidth to reallocate precision elsewhere. Only then does it slide the fader up on the wing, recognize the structural prediction error, and allow the fact that the engine is missing to pop into your conscious attention.
This makes me think of the algorithms inside high-end noise-canceling headphones.
Oh, how so?
They have exterior microphones that listen to the ambient drone of the airplane cabin. The internal processor calculates the exact frequency of that hum and generates a perfectly inverted sound wave to physically cancel it out, while leaving the frequencies of the flight attendant's voice untouched.
That's exactly what's happening mathematically.
Right. So if human attention is just my brain turning up the volume on reliable signals and generating an inverted wave to mute the unreliable ones, does that mean cognitive failures like inattentional blindness aren't actually failures at all?
They aren't failures.
When I look right at my keys on the counter and don't see them, my eyes aren't failing. I am falling victim to a wildly successful, over-aggressive muting algorithm in my own brain.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it, yes. When you fail to see the missing engine or your keys on the counter, your visual cortex didn't break. The photons hit your retina perfectly. The failure is actually the byproduct of a highly efficient, necessary filtering system.
Wow.
Your brain's precision weighting architecture actively categorized that visual data as low-priority noise compared to whatever internal thought or external distractor was currently dominating the high-precision spotlight. Your attention is essentially a subconscious risk management protocol.
It calculates which sensory noise is mathematically worth spending your limited conscious energy on and ruthlessly suppresses the rest, just to keep you sane.
Exactly. Without that ruthless suppression, we would be paralyzed by the overwhelming complexity of every shifting shadow and background hum.
Okay, let's take stock of where we are. We have established the basic physical architecture of reality generation. The brain is an isolated generative model trying to minimize the thermodynamic threat of surprise.
Right.
It uses perceptual inference to change its internal guesses, active inference to manipulate the outside world, and precision weighting attention to act as the mixing board, controlling the volume of the prediction errors.
That is the foundation.
But this is the threshold. We understand how the brain processes data like a supercomputer. But how does this cold mathematical machinery actually create the spark? How do we cross the chasm from data processing to experiencing? How does an algorithm generate the feeling of being alive?
This is where we cross from the mechanics into the grand menagerie of consciousness theories. Bayesian cognitive science has spawned several distinct camps, all trying to explain how predictive processing crosses that threshold.
And Rural organizes them.
Yes, Ruo organizes these theories by dividing consciousness into two fundamental categories. We have to start with the first category, access consciousness.
Access consciousness. This is the concept of how information becomes available to your working memory, how a piece of data becomes something you can explicitly report on, talk about, or use to deliberately guide your physical actions.
It is the battle for the spotlight in the theater of your mind.
Exactly.
Your brain is processing millions of things unconsciously. Access consciousness is the mechanism that elevates one specific thing to the level where you can say, I see that. Rewrote groups a few major theories under this access umbrella. Let's start with the most straightforward one, proposed originally by Jacob Howie, called the winning hypothesis, or the WH account.
The winning hypothesis. So a competition?
A constant, cutthroat competition. At any given millisecond, your brain is not just generating one guess about reality. It is generating multiple, competing, parallel hypotheses about what might be causing the sensory input.
And they are being graded.
Yes. These hypotheses are continuously graded based on their posterior probability.
What goes into that grade?
Two things: accuracy and precision. Accuracy means how well the hypothesis explains away the bottom-up sensory data. Precision means how reliable the brain thinks the data and the prior expectations are. The hypotheses are scored, and the WH account posits that whichever side hypothesis achieves the highest posterior probability simply becomes your conscious perception.
So the winner takes the spotlight. There are no second places in consciousness.
None.
The paper illustrates this using a famous optical illusion called binocular rivalry, which makes the competition incredibly literal. Let's break this down. In a lab, you put on a pair of specialized goggles.
Okay.
The goggles show your left eye a picture of a red house. They show your right eye a picture of a green face. Now, your brain is receiving two completely different high-quality, high-precision streams of visual data simultaneously.
Right.
The camera model of perception says you should just see what the eyes see.
Oh, big.
So do you see a weird, translucent red house, green face mashup?
No, you never see a mashup. Instead, your conscious perception begins to wildly oscillate. You look through the goggles, and for about 3 seconds, you see only the green face. The house completely disappears from your reality.
It's just gone.
Entirely gone. Then suddenly the face vanishes, and you see only the red house for 3 seconds. Then back to the face. It flips back and forth as long as you wear the goggles.
But why does it flip? What is the math actually doing behind the scenes?
It flips because of the brain's prior expectations. Your brain has a massive, lifelong, deeply entrenched prior belief that two solid, opaque objects cannot occupy the exact same point in physical space at the exact same time.
Right.
The hypothesis of a face house is assigned an incredibly low probability. The brain refuses to model it.
It violates the physics engine of the simulation.
Exactly. So the brain is forced to pick one winner. Let's say the face hypothesis barely edges out the house hypothesis in probability. The face wins the spotlight, and you consciously perceive the face. But here's the critical part. While you are looking at the face, the visual data of the red house is still pouring into your left retina.
But the brain is ignoring it
The brain is entirely failing to explain away that house data.
because the winning face model can't account for the red pixels.
Right, so a massive pile of prediction error begins to rapidly accumulate from the left eye. The unmodeled sensory data acts like mounting water pressure against a dam. Within a few seconds, this massive error severely degrades the precision of the face hypothesis.
The math becomes unstable.
The face hypothesis collapses under the weight of the error, and the brain abruptly drops it and switches to the second best guess, which is the house.
The house becomes the new winning hypothesis.
But then the exact same thing happens in reverse. The data from the face piles up as unexplained prediction error, destabilizes the house, and the brain flips back to the face.
So when I am looking at an optical illusion and my perception is flickering back and forth, I am not experiencing a glitch in my eyes. I am literally witnessing a tied vote in the parliament of my brain.
That's exactly what it is.
The two leading political parties, the House Party and the Face Party, are gridlocked. And my conscious experience is just the violent transfer of power back and forth. That is an incredibly cool way to experience your own neurobiology.
It makes the invisible math palpable. Now, the winning hypothesis is elegant, but some theorists argue it isn't enough. It explains who wins the race, but it doesn't explain the finish line.
Okay, what do you mean?
This brings us to the second access theory Raro discusses, the predictive global neuronal workspace, or PGNW.
The global workspace theory has been around for a while. How does it merge with this Bayesian predictive stuff?
PGNW takes the idea of the winning hypothesis, but it adds a specific anatomical mechanism and, crucially, a functional trigger. It asks, why does the winning hypothesis become conscious? PGNW proposes that consciousness is not just the highest score. Consciousness occurs when a hypothesis accumulates enough statistical evidence to warrant a fundamental shift in the brain's operation.
A shift to what?
Specifically, a shift from perceptual inference to active inference.
From passively guessing to preparing to act.
Precisely. As long as your brain's just tentatively updating its model perceptual inference, the processing remains largely unconscious. You're taking in data, tweaking the dials, but not committing.
Right.
But the moment the brain's statistical confidence reaches a critical threshold where it decides, okay, I am certain enough in this hypothesis to actually base a physical action on it, everything changes.
Because action is expensive and risky. If you are going to run from the tiger, you need to be sure it's a tiger.
Exactly. Action requires absolute stability in the model. So when the brain commits to action, it triggers a massive synchronized broadcast of the winning hypothesis across the entire brain. This broadcast is routed through the prefrontal parietal network, essentially the brain's main switchboard for executive function.
And that broadcast is what we feel.
This sudden, widespread broadcast is called global ignition, and the PGNW theory argues that this ignition, this brain-wide sharing of the data to coordinate action, is conscious access.
Okay, I have a major pushback on this.
Go for it.
If PGNW claims that conscious access structurally requires the brain to prepare for physical active inference, what about states where action is impossible or absent? What about a completely paralyzed patient with locked-in syndrome? Or what if I am floating in a pitch-black sensory deprivation tank, completely physically still, moving absolutely no muscles, doing nothing but silently contemplating philosophy? I am profoundly conscious in that tank. Am I utilizing a totally different mechanism? Or is the theory defining action in a way that doesn't just mean moving my arms and legs?
That is a highly perceptive critique, and one that is intensely debated in the literature. The answer lies in your last point. The definition of action in the free energy framework is much broader than skeletal movement. It includes what theorists call covert action.
Covert action, like internal movement.
Exactly. Shifting your internal attention from a memory of yesterday to a plan for tomorrow is mathematically modeled as a form of active inference. Retrieving a specific fact from your memory banks is a policy selection and action.
Oh, I see.
The PGNW theorists argue that holding a philosophical thought in your working memory, keeping it stable so you can logically manipulate it, is enough of a cognitive action to require that brain-wide global ignition. The brain is locking in the hypothesis to guide internal mental behavior, even if the physical body is entirely dormant.
So even thinking, even silent contemplation, is an action that forces the brain to commit to a stable reality. Okay, that satisfies my pushback. Let's look at the third access theory mentioned in the paper, the higher order state space, or HOSS. This was proposed by Stephen Fleming, and it feels a bit more meta, a bit more like Inception.
It is deeply meta.
Yeah.
Fleming's HOS model addresses a gap in the global workspace theory. It argues that simply broadcasting a piece of data like the visual image of an apple isn't enough to make you aware of it. The brain needs a separate explicit mechanism to know that it is seeing the apple.
Needs to know it knows.
Exactly. HOS argues that awareness is an explicit, higher-order variable embedded in the brain's generative model.
To try to visualize this,
Hmm.
if my brain is a factory, I have the machinery on the floor building the cars. That is the lower order sensory processing, mapping the shape and color of the apple. But HOS says there is a manager sitting in an office above the factory floor.
That's a great way to put it. And the manager doesn't build cars. The manager's only job is to monitor whether the machines are running. The manager represents the higher-order variable. The brain possesses a specific variable that models the state of whether or not it is currently aware of the apple.
But why go through all that extra computational effort? Why do we need a separate manager variable just to say, I am aware? Doesn't the winning hypothesis speak for itself?
Fleming justifies this by pointing out a fascinating psychological asymmetry. Let's compare two states of ignorance. Think about being completely unaware of an apple sitting on the table behind you.
Okay?
Now think about being completely unaware of a hammer sitting on the table behind you. Functionally and phenomenally from the inside, those two states are completely identical.
Right. Nothingness is just nothing, though.
Exactly. Ignorance is just a flat line. There is no qualitative difference between not seeing an apple and not seeing a hammer.
Because you don't know they are there.
Right. But compare the opposite. Being consciously aware of an apple versus being consciously aware of a hammer. Those are vastly different, incredibly rich, distinct, phenomenal states.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Fleming argues that the hypothesis I am currently aware is not a simple switch. To turn on the aware variable requires the brain to suddenly account for a massive influx of rich, specific, lower-level data. The manager looks down and suddenly has to process all the details of the car being built.
So flipping the switch from unaware to aware causes a systemic shock.
Exactly. Updating the generative model to include this new meta-belief of awareness generates a massive cascading wave of prediction error. The brain has to fundamentally restructure its ongoing model to accommodate the fact that it is now actively perceiving something. And according to HOSS, it is precisely this large cascade of internal prediction error, produced specifically when the higher-order aware variable switches on, that serves as the catalyst for the global ignition we talked about in the workspace theory.
So in the HOS model, consciousness isn't just the winning data. It's the brain explicitly concluding, I am a system that is currently seeing something. And the shockwave of that realization is the access.
You nailed it.
All three of these theories, the winning hypothesis, the global workspace, the higher order state space, they are brilliantly constructed logic puzzles. They beautifully explain the mechanics of the spotlight. They explain how a thought wins the race and becomes accessible. But honestly, they all completely fail to explain the most important thing,
Which is?
why the spotlight feels like anything.
Oh, yes.
I understand how the data gets broadcast, but a highly advanced self-driving car processes prediction errors. It takes in visual data of a stop sign, compares it to its internal map, resolves the error, updates its generative model, and shifts from perceptual to active inference by slamming on the brakes. The self-driving car has access consciousness. But presumably, the car's computer does not feel the vibrant redness of the stop sign. It does not feel the visceral anxiety of a near-miss collision. Why isn't human Bayesian processing just happening in the dark like a computer? Why do we have phenomenal consciousness, the qualia, the actual subjective, what it's like of an experience?
You have just articulated the hard problem of consciousness. It is the Everest of cognitive science. And Moreau's paper outlines 4 major, highly distinct theories trying to tackle this phenomenal side of the equation using the Bayesian toolkit.
Let's start with the one that I find simultaneously the most elegant and the most infuriating. The Bayesian attention schema theory, or BAST. This is largely rooted in the work of neuroscientist Michael Graziano.
BAST is provocative because it suggests that phenomenal consciousness, the very feeling of your own soul, your awareness, is essentially a highly efficient, mathematically necessary lie that the brain tells itself. Let's go back to our earlier discussion of attention. We established that attention is the brain's control of precision weightings. It is the sliding of the volume faders.
Right, the mixing board.
Well, to control a complex piece of machinery like a mixing board, the brain needs a model of it. Just like it needs a model of the arm to move the arm, it needs a model of its own attention to direct its attention. It creates what Graciano calls an attention schema.
Okay.
But here is the critical trick. Modeling the literal physical truth of attention would be computationally disastrous.
Because the literal truth is billions of microscopic biological events.
Exactly. To accurately model its own attention, the brain would have to track millions of individual neurons firing, track the synthesis and binding of neurotransmitters, and compute the real-time inverse variance of thousands of probability distributions. If the brain tried to model that level of complexity, it would overfit, crash, and you would die. It would take all your metabolic energy just to watch yourself think.
So the equation demands a reduction in complexity. The brain aggressively simplifies the model.
It creates a highly sparse, frugal, almost cartoonish model of its own attention. It intentionally strips away all the physical, mechanistic, messy biological details. And because the self-model is entirely devoid of physical descriptors, the resulting experience feels ineffable.
It feels magical.
It feels ethereal, non-physical, magical. When you introspect, you don't feel like a wet biological machine calculating statistical variance. You feel like a floating, immaterial spirit of pure awareness. Graziano argues that the magic of consciousness is a user illusion caused entirely by the necessary frugality of the brain's self-model.
I love this because I can map it perfectly onto how I use my laptop. Let's use the desktop folder analogy.
Let's hear it.
When I open my laptop and look at the screen, I see a little blue square icon. I point at it and say, that blue folder is my novel. But there is no literal blue folder inside the hardware of the computer. There is no physical file. The blue folder is a graphical illusion.
Right.
It is a user interface designed to hide the staggering complexity of millions of microscopic electrical states, the zeros and ones flipping on the hard drive.
If the computer forced you to interact with the raw machine code just to open your document, you would never be able to write your novel.
Exactly. The blue folder is a necessary user illusion that allows for efficient, high-level control of the system. BAST is arguing that our majestic feeling of consciousness, our qualia, is just the brain's blue folder icon for its own attention. It's a user interface for the mind.
That is a brilliant translation of the theory. The brain hides its own math from you because a compressed, fictionalized summary is infinitely more useful for survival than a raw data dump. And this concept of compression aligns very closely with the second phenomenal theory Verro discusses, generative entanglement, or GE. This is put forward by Andy Clark, who is a titan in predictive processing.
How does Clark's entanglement theory differ from Graziano's user illusion?
Clark focuses less on attention and more on the body. He argues that qualia, the vivid redness of a red apple, the sharp blinding pain of a stubbed toe, are what he calls mid-level abbreviations.
Mid-level abbreviations.
Remember that the brain is not isolated in a jar. It is intimately entangled with the biological body. When you encounter a physical stimulus, like stubbing your toe, your entire autonomic nervous system reacts. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing changes, adrenaline is released, muscle fibers contract, inflammatory pathways open.
A massive cascade of microscopic physical reactions.
Yes. And to predict and control this massive, chaotic web of bodily reactions, the brain must generate a model. But again, tracking every single cortisol molecule is too complex. So the brain generates a coarse-grained abbreviation. It compresses the thousands of microreactions into a single high-level, easily manageable hypothesis.
Okay.
You don't consciously perceive the exact firing rate of your nociceptors. Your brain compresses all of that data into a mid-level abbreviation called pain.
It's a physiological shorthand.
Exactly. And here is why it feels undeniable. Because this shorthand operates at the very top level of your conscious self-model, you cannot see behind it. There is no higher level internal system capable of explaining to you how the pain abbreviation was algorithmically generated. So as the agent, you take it as an undeniable, irreducible reality. It just is.
Okay, I have to step in and push back heavily on both Graziano and Clark here.
I figured you might.
Because to me, calling phenomenal experience an abbreviation or a user illusion feels like a philosopher performing a semantic sleight of hand. Does this actually solve the hard problem? Because here's my issue. Whether you call it a computationally efficient data compression or a frugal schema or an abbreviation, it still hurts when I stub my toe.
It undeniably hurts.
The subjective, agonizing reality of the pain is completely undeniable. Going back to my laptop analogy. The computer uses the blue folder icon to open the file efficiently, but the computer doesn't feel the folder. It doesn't experience the blueness. Why does our biological abbreviation have a rich, felt, qualitative dimension?
You are echoing the exact persistent critique that philosophers of mind level against illusionism and abbreviation theories. Critics argue that these Bayesian theories brilliantly explain why human beings report feeling things. They explain why we believe our feelings are magical and non-physical. They explain the functional utility of the abbreviation, but they arguably fail to explain the intrinsic feeling itself.
They explain the plumbing, but not the water.
Right, which is why Rorot includes a radically different approach in the paper, dual-aspect monism, or DAM. This was developed by the neuropsychoanalyst Mark Solms. And Solms tackles the feeling problem directly by looking in a completely different part of the brain.
This is fascinating because almost all the theories we've discussed so far and almost all modern neuroscience really focus intensely on the cerebral cortex, the wrinkly outer layer of the brain where high-level thinking, language, and complex visual processing happen.
Yes, the cortex is universally treated as the throne of consciousness. If you don't have a functioning cortex, the assumption is that you cannot be conscious. But Solms completely upends this by pointing to a striking and frankly heartbreaking medical phenomenon. Children born with a rare condition called hydranencephaly.
What happens in hydranencephaly?
These children are born completely lacking a cerebral cortex. Due to vascular accidents in utero, the entire cortical mantle is destroyed. Their cranium is largely filled with cerebrospinal fluid, leaving only the ancient deep brain structures, the brainstem, and the diencephalon intact.
Based on the cortical theories of consciousness, like global workspace or higher-order state space, these children should be absolute philosophical zombies. Without a cortex, they shouldn't have the hardware for awareness.
Exactly. They should be entirely comatose, devoid of any inner life, but they are not. Despite having zero cortical tissue, these children wake up, they fall asleep, and more importantly, they exhibit clear, undeniable, affective emotional states. They show pleasure when held, they show distress and cry. They react appropriately to their caregivers, they arch their backs in frustration. They clearly possess a phenomenal what it is like to be them.
Which completely shatters the idea that consciousness is just high-level cortical data crunching.
Solms uses this to argue that consciousness does not originate in the high-level cognitive cortical centers. It originates in the ancient subcortical structures of the brainstem, the reticular activating system, and the periaqueductal gray. These are the parts of the brain responsible for raw biological survival.
How does Solms define consciousness, then, if it isn't complex thought?
Solms defines phenomenal consciousness fundamentally as felt uncertainty. Remember the free energy principle. The organism must stay within its narrow survival parameters, its homeostasis. When the organism encounters an unpredicted context, when it strays from its necessary survival state, it experiences this deviation mathematically as an increase in free energy.
Right.
But Solms argues that the organism experiences this subjectively as an intrinsically value-laden feeling.
A feeling, not just a data point.
Yes. A bad feeling, pain, hunger, cold, anxiety is the literal subjective experience of moving toward entropy and death. A good feeling, warmth, satiety, comfort, is the subjective experience of moving back toward the safety of the free energy minimum. For Solms, consciousness isn't about intelligently mapping the external world. It is about feeling the biological imperative to survive.
That is so powerful.
The qualitative nature of experience, the hard problem, is solved by grounding it in the precarious life-for-death vulnerability of biology. You feel because you can die.
That is an incredibly profound, humbling shift. It grounds the magic of consciousness not in advanced mathematical geometry, but in the fragile vulnerability of having a body. But speaking of geometry, there's one more phenomenal theory Roro mentions that we need to touch on, the projective consciousness model, or PCM. I know the math behind this one is staggering, but what is the conceptual core?
PCM takes a strictly geometric approach to the hard problem. It argues that for any generative model to support a subjective, conscious experience, it must compute a specific type of perspective. Consciousness is not just a list of facts. It inherently has a point of view. It has a here and a there.
A self-localized in space.
Exactly. PCM argues that the brain literally computes this perspective using projective geometry. It takes multidimensional, raw sensory data and runs it through complex mathematical transformations to project it into a specific 3D projective space. And crucially, this projection requires an origin point, a central vector around which the space is organized.
The vanishing point in a painting.
Yes. If you walk through an art museum and look at a landscape painting from the side, it looks distorted. You have to stand dead center at the precise point the artist intended for the perspective to snap into 3D reality. PCM argues the brain does this mathematically. The self is not a spirit. It is the mathematical origin point of the projective geometry. The unique, ineffable quality of consciousness simply arises from the mathematical structure of this projective transformation. You feel like a self, because the math demands a center point to render the simulation.
Okay, let's take a deep breath. We have just laid out a massive, sprawling menu of theories. We have Graciano's frugal user illusions. We have Clark's body-entangled abbreviations. We have Solm's subcortical life-or-death survival feelings. We have PCM's projective geometry. We have Howey's winning hypotheses and Fleming's metavariables. To a layperson, to me, these seem entirely disconnected. They sound like they were describing completely different species of thought. They share the word Bayesian, but that's about it.
And that apparent chaos is exactly the problem Victor Rousseau set out to solve. The entire premise of his paper is that these theories are not as disconnected as they appear. They are looking at different floors of the same building. He argues they are all relying on the exact same underlying mathematical architecture.
Which brings us to the grand synthesis, the search for the minimal unifying model, the MUM. Introduce us to this concept.
The concept of the minimal unifying model was introduced by another philosopher, Wonjo Wise. The goal of a MUM is not to create a mega theory that perfectly explains every single microscopic detail of consciousness. That would be a maximum model, which is impossible right now. A MUM aims to identify only the absolute necessary properties. What are the bare minimum foundational conditions that all of these disparate theories implicitly require to function?
Burroughs examines all these theories, puts them through a sieve, and what is his core thesis? What is left in the pan? What are the lowest common denominators of consciousness?
Rousseau argues that across every single one of these Bayesian theories, no matter how ideologically different they seem, two distinct properties are absolutely mathematically necessary for consciousness to exist: precision and complexity.
The volume knob and the trade-off.
Precisely. Let's look at how he maps these two properties onto the two sides of consciousness we just spent the last half hour discussing. First, precision. Rowe argues that precision optimization is the universal underlying mechanism for all forms of access consciousness.
So precision is the spotlight.
Exactly. Think about the theories. In the winning hypothesis, conscious access is granted to the model that secures the highest precision score. In the global workspace theory, the global ignition is triggered when a guess achieves enough precision to stabilize for action. In the higher-order state space, the metavariable acts by weighing the precision of the lower-level sensory states.
Right. It all comes back to precision.
At its core, underneath the different terminology, conscious access across all theories is simply the act of the brain successfully assigning high precision to a prediction error, turning the volume up enough that it dominates the cognitive workspace.
If precision handles the spotlight of access, what handles the hard problem? What handles the phenomenal experience?
That is where complexity comes in. Rousseau argues that the management and restriction of complexity is what universally generates the phenomenal structure, the what it's like. Remember the fundamental trade-off. To survive, to avoid overfitting, the brain must aggressively limit the complexity of its models.
The blue desktop folder. The map of the coastline.
Yes, and look at the phenomenal theories. Graziano's frugal attention schema is, by definition, a radical reduction of complexity. Clark's mid-level abbreviations are a reduction of the complexity of the body's autonomic reactions. Even Solm's theory of subcortical feelings is a way to compress vast, chaotic amounts of homeostatic data into a simple, low-complexity binary variable. I feel good, or I feel bad.
So the limitation of the math is the feature, not the bug.
Exactly. Because the biological brain is forced by the free energy principle to compress data into an efficient, low-complexity generative model, it purposefully strips away the mechanistic, physical reality of the neurons. This mathematically necessary lack of complexity is precisely what creates the illusion of the ineffable, non-physical quality of phenomenal experience. You feel like a soul because your brain doesn't have the computing power to render the truth of the meat.
So to put this in terms for our listener, to bring this all the way home, your consciousness, the very soul of your subjective experience right now as you listen to my voice, is at its absolute mathematical core an act of radical data compression, paired with a highly selective volume knob.
That is the minimal unifying model of Bayesian consciousness.
But Rousseau has to vigorously defend this synthesis, right? Because the paper addresses a major aggressive criticism from two researchers, Marvin and Havlik. I want to represent their argument because it's exactly what a skeptic would say. They basically point at predictive processing and say, look, this is just statistics. This is a generic mathematical toolbox. You cannot explain the magic of a conscious thought with just inverse variance and probability distributions. You still need to bolt on an external older theory, like the global workspace theory, to do the actual heavy lifting of explaining the consciousness part. How does Rorou counter the accusation that this is just a statistical relabeling exercise?
Rorou counters this by arguing that Bayesian cognitive science isn't just a passive set of labels you slap onto older theories. It actually provides the native mechanistic engines that those older theories completely lacked.
What do you mean by engine?
Take the global workspace theory. Before the Bayesian framework, the theory basically said a thought enters the workspace, and then magically the information broadcasts across the brain to all the other networks. It described the what, but not the why or the how.
It was just magic.
Rua points out that Bayesian tools actually explain the trigger. The ignition doesn't just happen by magic. It is forced by the mathematical demand to resolve massive prediction errors, or the sudden necessity to stabilize a high-precision model for active inference. The free energy principle provides the actual physical and mathematical engine that drives the broadcast. It doesn't need to borrow from old theories, it fulfills them.
Okay, if Rurou is right, if precision and complexity are the literal flour and water of consciousness, the absolute lowest common denominators, I have to ask the elephant in the room question, and I think every listener is thinking about this. Artificial intelligence.
The inevitable horizon.
We are surrounded by neural networks and large language models that literally operate on these exact Bayesian principles. An AI manages precision weightings in its attention heads. It utilizes loss functions to minimize prediction error. It is constantly battling the exact same mathematical trade-off between complexity and accuracy to avoid overfitting its training data. If AI is actively managing the exact same mathematical parameters that form the minimal unifying model of our consciousness, does that mean AI is fundamentally on the exact same spectrum of sentience as we are? Are they conscious?
That is the existential question of our current era. Rowart's paper focuses on human consciousness and doesn't dive deeply into AI, but Carl Friston's own broader work, specifically a concept referenced here called Markovian monism, touches directly on this implication.
What is a Markov blanket? We need to define that carefully.
A Markov blanket is a concept for machine learning, but Friston applies it to physics and biology. Simply put, a Markov blanket is a statistical boundary that separates internal states from external states. It mediates the exchange of information.
Give me a physical example.
The membrane of a single-celled paramecium is a physical Markov blanket. It separates the internal chemistry of the cell from the water outside and only lets certain information or nutrients pass through. Your human skin, your skull, your sensory organs collectively, they form the Markov blanket of your brain.
So it's the wall between the inside and the outside.
Yes. And Friston argues mathematically that any system bounded by a Markov blanket, any system that acts to maintain its boundary against the entropy of the environment, will mathematically appear to possess a primitive form of sentience simply by existing. Because to maintain its boundary, it must predict the environment. It will behave as if it has beliefs and intentions.
So an artificial neural network, which has a distinct boundary between its internal weights and the external user prompts, could be viewed mathematically as having a proto-perspective, is maintaining a state.
Mathematically, structurally, yes. The math of free energy and precision weighting applies to a single cell, a human brain, and potentially an artificial neural network. However, there's a massive caveat that brings us back to Mark Solms. Biological consciousness, specifically the rich, phenomenal feeling of consciousness, is deeply rooted in the threat of biological death.
The thermodynamic vulnerability.
Exactly. The homeostatic imperative to avoid thermodynamic equilibrium. An AI minimizes a mathematical loss function, but it doesn't die if it fails to predict the next word correctly. It doesn't have a biological body entangled in a precarious, far from equilibrium state that requires visceral, agonizing feelings to manage. It doesn't have a brainstem calculating survival. So while the syntax of consciousness, precision, and complexity might be shared between us and the machines, the biological semantics, the meaning derived from the constant threat of death are completely different.
The machine does the math, but the machine doesn't bleed. Wow. Okay. This has been an absolutely monumental journey. Let's try to summarize the value of this deep dive for the listener to pack this all into a paradigm they can walk away with. We started with the illusion of the camera, the comforting idea that you are a passive observer walking through an objective world.
And we've methodically dismantled that camera.
We are ending with the realization that you are an isolated, precarious biological system. You are trapped behind a statistical wall, a Markov blanket. You have absolutely no direct access to reality. Your brain is trapped in a dark skull, desperately throwing predictions at the outside world, frantically updating its internal simulation, trying to minimize the chaotic, entropic surprise of existence.
Your entire conscious experience, the vibrant colors you see, the sharp pain you feel, the choices you believe you are making, is simply your brain's winning hypothesis. It is a simulation smoothed out by a mathematically enforced lack of complexity and highlighted by the precise volume knob of your attention. You are a world builder, and the crucial realization is that the world you are building is the one you are currently walking around in.
Which leads me to a final, highly provocative paradox that I want you, the listener, to chew on today. The entire foundation of every single theory we discuss, the free energy principle, dictates that living things must minimize surprisal to survive. The math demands that we avoid surprise. We are biologically, structurally built to predict the world perfectly to avoid the chaos of entropy.
Our biology fundamentally demands predictability and safety.
Right. It demands boredom, essentially. Yet, as humans, we do the exact opposite. We intentionally, actively seek out massive artificial surprise. We strap ourselves into roller coasters to experience the unpredicted sensation of falling. We watch thriller movies with twist endings we can't predict. We listen to complex jazz that purposefully violates our musical expectations. We spend thousands of dollars to travel to foreign countries specifically to feel disoriented by new languages and new environments.
It's a beautiful, glaring contradiction to the basic model of free energy.
Exactly. If our consciousness is an incredibly expensive biological machine mathematically built to eradicate surprise, why is the seeking of surprise the very thing that makes us feel the most intensely alive?
Perhaps it's because exploring the unknown, safely flirting with prediction errors, is the only way to proactively update our generative models. We seek out small, manageable surprises today to build a robust model that protects us from the fatal surprises of tomorrow. We play with chaos to learn how to master it.
Something to deeply mull over. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly expansive deep dive. As you go about your day-to-day, try to step outside the simulation for a moment. Pay attention to the little prediction errors, the mud splashes on your airplane, the stubborn hypotheses you refuse to update, the way your attention turns the volume up and down on the world. Notice the anxious fortune teller inside your head, furiously dealing the cards. Keep questioning the simulation, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.